already mentioned, there might be an ever so slight chance that I get a very big parcel that I need to collect during the live stream. So I might have to very briefly drop out, but that shouldn't stop you from discussing this paper that I just put in the chat. It's called Defining Aphasia, Content Analysis of 6 Aphasia Diagnostic Batteries. And I thought it was quite an interesting one. Hang on, let me set this up properly. So you have the link. Let me share my screen. One thing at a time. Here we go. Okay, so now you can see the paper. It was just published in Cortex this month. And I thought it was quite interesting because it touches upon a couple of points that we usually not necessarily consider, but just take for granted. And that is that the tests that we use test what we think they test, which is basically content validity. So you assume that they have been validated and they all assess what it says on the box. So if you have an aphasia assessment, you hope that it does assess aphasia in a sense that you want to know whether a condition is present or not. So a yes/no answer. Ideally, you also want some detailed information on the nature and the condition of the condition if it is present. So these are the two things that ideally in a clinical setting we hope to get from a assessment. Now, there was a recent review of aphasia language tests in 2018. Is that so recent? It's 5 years. Where they concluded that there is no valid speech language test for diagnosing post-stroke aphasia, which is quite a big statement, arguably. And this current paper then set out to, as you can see, defining aphasia. And their way of doing it was to take 6 prominent aphasia assessments. This is the busiest Neuroccino we've had in a while. And we're going to come back to why they chose particularly those 6 tests, but mainly because they're regularly used in a clinical or research setting. But we're going to dive one level deeper in a minute. And it's fair to say that the tests they chose are quite US-centric, of course. It's a team from the US. But what they wanted to do is they wanted to look at those assessments and see where they converge and diverge in terms of the conceptualization of the tests, how they're designed, and what you actually do measure with them. Now, most of the tests were designed for diagnostic purposes back in the 1960s and 70s. So we're talking living history here. So they're not actually that old, but they can be quite different in terms of what's under the hood, so to say. Now, another thing they point out is that there is a lack of clarity what these tests capture, and that this has a direct impact on our understanding of aphasia, and then down the line will also impact rehabilitation efforts. Now, in terms of the diagnosis, the standing diagnosis as of today is that aphasia is an acquired language disorder, often due to brain injury that affects expressive and receptive language, meaning speech output and hearing speech or language in that case. Now, there's a couple of caveats why that definition may need to be updated, and that is because there's a couple of components that are debated in the literature at the moment that aren't really captured by this definition, such as the dimensionality of aphasia. So how many dimensions are there? And which dimensions do we have? Is also the role of cognitive processes in aphasia. So aphasia is defined as a language disorder but you also have impairments of memory and other cognitive functions that might actually play a role. And then also the etiology of aphasia, so whether it is a focal or a diffuse lesion, if it is a stroke or a tumor lesion, and so on and so forth. Now, what did they do in this paper? So they did a content analysis, which basically just means that they determined the presence of certain words, themes, and concepts within a qualitative text. So that would be the tests, and they also dived into the manuals of each test. And then using this content analysis, they can quantify and analyze the presence, meaning, and the relationship of such words, themes, and concepts. So that's broadly speaking what they did. And I said they used 6 aphasia battery tests. So we have the Minnesota test for differential diagnosis of aphasia. We have the PICA, Porch Index of Communicative Ability, the Boston Diagnostic Aphasia Examination, the BND that most people probably heard of is part of it, the Western Aphasia Battery, or the WAB, and the Comprehensive Aphasia Test, CAT, and the Quick Aphasia Battery. Now, as I said, they were chosen because they're clinically and research relevant, but also because they have different constructions behind them. So the working hypothesis was that given that all these tests are validated, that the result will be that they should be very similar, right? Since they all identify and characterize the presence of aphasia. And that if anything, there is some subtle differences in the test content that originate from the I can't say that word, the differences in the view of what aphasia is and where it comes from. And basically what they did is they selected the test that I just mentioned. Then they did a label convergence process, as they term it, which is a very nice way of saying that they looked at all the words and tried to cluster them into meaningful chunks. And they basically came up with 81 targets, so individual items, and 9 overall domains. And then they rate the complexity of each of these targets, do an inter-rater agreement, and where they don't agree, they have a discussion and try to come to an agreement. And in terms of assigning the domains, they try to stick to the domains that were specified in the manual, but didn't necessarily adhere to it in the end. And then they did a Jacquard index analysis, which I had to look up, never heard of that test. It's basically a fancy correlation that has roughly the same cutoffs as a normal correlation, but we kind of come back to that. Now, what they found, despite their assumption that it should all be high-ty and kind of the same and all good, they actually found that there's quite a weak Jacquard index. So let me find the numbers for you. We're going to come back to the other figures in a minute. Here you go. So these are the numbers, and you can see if you apply the general rule of correlation, then these are far from ideal, and especially if you cross-validate tests, you usually correlate a new test with an existing test where you know or assume to know that it tests the right thing. And if you do that between those tests, you actually get correlations as high as 0.98. So having quite weak indices here was a bit of a surprise in terms of assessing the similarity between them. And then they also found that there is only 5 targets that are actually consistent across all the 5 tests. And I think that is, here we go, just above. So all 6 tests, they have auditory comprehension for words, auditory comprehension for sentences, repetition of words, confrontation naming for nouns, and reading comprehension. Now, here it's also important to say that they cheated just a little bit because the Western Aphasia Battery has reading and writing as a supplementary part that is not actually often conducted in a clinical setting just because it takes time. So the conclusion is that there is a lot more ambiguity in the assessments and the definitions of aphasia than they expected, and that maybe it needs an update in the definition of aphasia, also considering the components that I mentioned earlier about dimensionality and other cognitive processes. So covered all of that. Yes, so there is 3 streams that they talk about that led to the different classifications of aphasia and the different tests. And I thought that was actually quite neat. Let me see if I can jump to the table. So these are the diagnostic tests, and I said there's another layer, not only their clinical and research prevalence, but also their conceptualization in terms of a localizationist approach to the brain or a non-localizationist approach to the brain. So they basically, in the introduction, highlight 3 streams, amongst others, but they took the time to specify 3 that directly influenced the creation of these assessments. And the first one is the localizationist approach. So one part of the brain, one region, does one function. That's the classical Broca-Wernicke model that we all heard of. Now, the second stream that they define is holism, which emphasizes that language is distributed in the brain, so not just confined to one area, but distributed across multiple. And what causes aphasia is not just language, but it also impacts the whole person, including psychosocial components. So that's more the Goldstein theory. And then the third stream, even though I don't fully agree with it, to be honest, because the first 2 are brain models. The third one is not a brain model, which is psycholinguistics. So psycho and linguistics, there's no brain in it. So I think it's a little bit unjust to put them all together, given that they're technically different things. But in terms of the influence and the conceptualization of the test is valid to include it. So psycholinguistic basically emerged from the psychology of language, and they began to apply aphasiology in the late 1800s and emphasized the need to understand precisely what is being localized in the brain. So concluding that language is too general of a term. So they wanted to know exactly the linguistic components and how they match onto the brain. So that's why they also chose those different tests to have a balance between those different concepts. Now, what I thought they did quite beautifully, and I haven't actually seen that before, is visualize their results like this. So here you have the different tests, and so the colors are the different tests, and if they're filled in, then they basically tick that box. And you can see that there is quite a diverse pattern of what components are actually tested by each of the different tests, but I thought this was quite a neat visual summary of the results. Anything else that we need to discuss? These are all the details about the individual targets, but as I said, there's 81, so we're not going to go into too much detail, but you can read that later. And then the overall domains that were specified, that they then contained into 9 overall domains, and you see how they were assigned. We did this. I think that's it. Yes. That's all I have for you. Happy to take questions. Okay, if there's no question. Okay, Valentina. Oh, here we go.
Thank you for the presentation, Steph. So I was puzzled by the introduction because you said they thought of this paper as we have multiple assessments for aphasia, and the prior was that they are similar because they all assessing aphasia, but at least from my study, because I'm not in the aphasia field, but at least from my studies in my master's degrees with Carlos Emenza, I remember that aphasia is actually quite scattered, very difficult, multi-faceted cognitive function. Disruption of cognitive function that could manifest in so many ways. And I knew some of these tests, not all of them, and they actually are a bit different, which is what they get in the results, right? But I'm just puzzled by the beginning of the paper. So.
And I think part of that is because there is quite a divide between clinical and research worlds. The clinical world needs a test to identify aphasia, yes, no, and then maybe to shortcut communication and trajectory for the patient is also helpful to shortcut the kind of diagnosis or the label. So classically, you would get notes where it says patient with Broca-like aphasia or Wernicke-like aphasia or patient with expressive difficulty. So you get a rough idea of what the symptom complex is and how to tackle it. Now, in the research world, we go way more into detail because our purpose is a different one, right? We don't need to diagnose and apply therapy. We're just interested by the phenomenon and want to understand it better. So you dive into a lot more complexity of the clinical presentation, and you have more time to assess the patient as well. That's a very important thing that I'm going to come back to in a minute. So these tests do test different things, but also because they're conceptually slightly different in a sense that they want to get that diagnosis as reliably as they can. And then it comes back to how do you actually define aphasia to then design the test to get a reliable diagnosis, right? If you define aphasia as a problem of naming objects, then you're going to include a naming task. If, on the other hand, you think naming is not actually a defining factor for aphasia, it's just a byproduct, then you leave it out. So that's how you get those nuances. But the assumption that they all test roughly the same thing is because they're all diagnostic aphasia tests, and they've all been validated with that classical correlation between them. And as I mentioned, if you do that with those tests, they actually correlate 0.98 down to 7.4, I think. So quite good correlations between them. So you would expect that they do test roughly the same thing, but then if you look at these new indices here in the Jacquard analysis for the pairwise comparison, then maybe what we do test is the coherence between the items, but not necessarily a coherence between the concept behind it.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. And just one last question, sorry guys, because I gotta go. And how does it go back to the brain? I didn't really get the table with how the brain works and how does it relate to the tests.
Oh, there wasn't really a table, I think, on how the brain works.
No, the approach is that those tests reflect on how the brain
correct. So the way these tests were designed, the first test came out based on a localizationist view of the brain, classical model, lesion to Broca's area gives you articulation deficits, lesion to Wernicke's area gives you comprehension deficits. So they design tests based on that framework of language in the brain, or aphasia in the brain in that case, and included articulation and comprehension tests, for example. But then as the concept evolved, you moved on to holism. So suddenly the areas per se weren't as important anymore, and you added verbal short-term memory tests, for example. So that's the link, how the tests evolved, given how our brain models evolved.
Which explains also the difference.
Correct.
Thank you.
Chris.
Hey, it sounds a bit like a bunch of problems that happened in a lot of domains, not only in neuroscience. It's a problem of the boxes we use to sort things, group things together. And is it possible that aphasia is actually a bunch of different, like it's something that we should divide more than just having the big box of aphasia? Or it could be the opposite, actually. It could be that because there are different tests that are correlated but not comparable that much between each other, it might be that it is the reflection of a more global problem. So is it a problem of the size of the box where we put aphasia in? So
again, depending on the philosophy that you come from, you have different boxes, or you just don't. There you are. So there obviously is this big, this is aphasia box, but then you have those sub boxes of fluent and non-fluent aphasia. You have a sub box for Broca, Wernicke conduction, transcortical, transsensory. So very much the school of thought that you come from defines how many boxes you have and how big they are. Now, clinically speaking, those boxes aren't extremely helpful, because it's nice to put everyone in one specific drawer and say, this is what you have, stick a label on it. But then the reality is that the presentation is usually a lot more mixed than the tests would suggest. So people who struggle with articulation usually also have some level of comprehension deficits, and vice versa. It's not as clear cut. So those boxes aren't necessarily helpful. They're certainly helpful in research terms, because we need to operate. I don't have a day for words today. We need to define things properly in research settings, but then the reality usually looks a little bit different. So I think that the very important question that you raise is, do we need to go more detailed and have more boxes, or do we actually need to get rid of all the boxes and think bigger? Just also something they briefly touch upon in the discussion. And I guess time will tell.
Yeah, because it can be an issue. I mean, it's like if you talk about stroke, and then you talk about treatments. If you use thrombolysis on all the strokes, you're gonna kill people, because because it's not only ischemic. It will work on ischemic strokes, but not on hemorrhagic, right? So like it could. I mean, if you use two big boxes, you might not help the patients if you put them in the same box as.
Yeah, so thrombolysis is an interesting one here, because thrombolysis means that if there is a clot, you go in with basically a high dose aspirin and you disperse the clot and reinstall blood perfusion to the brain. Or you actually go in and mechanically remove the clot. Those are the two options, and they should be applied as soon as possible, because time is brain. Now, if you give thrombolysis to someone who has a bleed, which is a lot less common than a clot in the brain, because it's high dose aspirin, effectively you thin down the blood and you make the bleed worse, right? So not a good idea. But you don't blindly give thrombolysis to people. You do a quick
but that's what I mean, is like, because we know that the box of stroke is not good enough to give a treatment to patients. We had to separate it in at least 2 boxes, right? So could that be the same with the aphasia? I don't know.
It could be. There's also an interesting interaction between the two, because usually people with aphasia tend to get thrombolysis more often because it's a striking deficit that is very obvious. So aphasic patients tend to get thrombolysis more commonly than non-aphasic patients. But yeah, so the definition of the boxes, or the new definition of aphasia, so I love that the title is, defining aphasia, content analysis of 6 aphasia diagnostic batteries. But they don't actually define it in the paper. They just give the definition that is currently out there, and they give all the things that we may want to consider in defining, and they make the claim that we probably need a new definition, but they don't actually define it.
Cool.
And then also on the same subject, there is also another kind of population, which is a neurodegenerative disorder that exhibit a completely different spectrum of symptoms, and symptoms occurring with aphasia that you can really not dissociate so easily. So so that in defense of the authors, they actually do make the point that this is limited to the stroke population and not including neurodegenerative populations or tumor populations and whatever, because the types of aphasia you see are different. So this is stroke only. Sabrina, you've been waiting.
Yeah, thanks. Well, yeah, as you said, and we know, so the language is really complex. So I'm wondering if they consider also what is the language process that you are going to analyze in each task. So I'm thinking if they consider also like semantic, morphosyntax, and etc. So this part of analysis or specific one, or not.
You didn't actually have to specify what you were after. I knew morphosyntax and thematic roles. So if you look, hang on, let me share the screen so you don't all have to find it. So if you look at table 2, you can see the individual things that we're looking at in the tests. So you have conversational questions, novel sentences, spoken picture description, la-di-da-di-da, auditory comprehension of words, sentences, complex words. Some of them have non-words as well. So you have a whole range of things that were looked at in individual tests. Now, they usually don't go down, especially for clinical purposes, to the nitty-gritty of morphosyntax and thematic role assignment. It's more a big picture of, can you name an object? Do you know what an object is? Can you communicate? But you will find there's differences in each of these tests and how detailed they assess it. But also it comes with the time that it then takes, right? So if you do the WAB, then you look at about a good hour, depending on the capability of the patient, for the assessment. You got to have that time. And also you're supposed to do tests that patients can do. So if that is something that's commonly impaired in the acute phase, it won't be in the tests for the acute assessment as much, because you don't necessarily want to frustrate the patients and just keep showing them what they can't do, but get a good picture of where they're at and where they potentially could go in the future if given the right therapy. And then the other thing is that the way they assess it is very different. So some of these tests would grade it and qualitatively assess how good you were able to perform one of the tasks, whereas other tests like the WAB is just like yes and no, and then sometimes waiting for individual items, but it's pretty much a dichotomous decision-making process. So these are the kind of differences in the level of detail that you can see.
Okay, yes. Okay, I see. Thanks.
Any other questions? Not that I can see. In that case, yeah, Eduardo.
Yeah, just curiosity, rather. I was wondering if they considered, and if not, why, to include tests from other languages, for example.
So very good question. That's what I said right in the beginning. It's quite US centric. They haven't included it in this analysis, but there is tests out there that are available in multiple languages. So I just, out of curiosity, looked at the Aachen Aphasia test this morning, AAT, which is one test that is quite prominent, and saw that it was even translated to Thai. So there is tests that are available in multiple languages, but the ones they looked at are US-centric tests. Very good question. Anything else? No, in that case, thank you very much for joining Neuroccino this morning. Have an exciting week in science, and I see you next Monday. The slot is still available, so volunteers are welcome. Have an exciting week. Bye.